Final hour of the Washington Journal on this final day of the year 2003, and we're switching topics once again back to foreign policy, specifically Saudi Arabia. Let me introduce you to our final guest of the morning, Wright, who is joining us from Austin, Texas. He's a staff writer at the New Yorker, and if I can reach around here, I want to get my New Yorker magazine to show our audience, Mr. Wright, your cover story this week called Kingdom of Silence. Ask the question, what is life like under the rule of the Saudi royal family? Tell your story about how you learned in up close and in detail more about what life is like there.
Well, I had been working on a book about terrorism, and I needed to go to Saudi Arabia. And for a year and a half, I couldn't get a visa, so I finally found I had to take a job. And it was the luckiest thing for me. I had got this job in Jeddah, which is Osama bin Laden's hometown, and working at a little newspaper called the Saudi Gazette. And I was coaching or mentoring these young Saudi reporters. And it was, you know, I had a lot of mixed feelings about what it would be like in Saudi Arabia, but I found it very vivid, interesting experience, and I really enjoyed the young people that I worked with.
When were you there?
I got there January 28th of last year, this year.
And stayed
for 3 months until the end of April.
And where did you live?
I decided I was going to live in a kind of middle-class Saudi flat. I didn't want to live in one of the compounds with foreigners. I wanted to be in Saudi society as much as I possibly could. So it was just a regular apartment building in Jeddah.
And am I correct that most or the majority of foreigners who live there do live in compounds, so they don't get to mingle as much with Saudi society?
That's right. It's, you know, they're behind closed walls for the most part, and they live in a kind of expatriate world, closing themselves off from the kind of experience they might have had there.
Now, if you had to describe it, what would you say would be the prevailing perception and perhaps misperception of Saudis in the United States? What are people's stereotypes about the Saudis?
Well, the stereotypes are that they're raving religious fanatics, and you know, I think the way most people see Saudis is either they are terrorists or they're oil princes. And there are terrorists and there are oil princes in that country, but that's not the predominant population. Most of the Saudis are just ordinary citizens trying to find a way to make a living.
We want to open up the phone lines because we talk so much about Saudi Arabia here, and I know many of you have questions. I'd prefer you ask them of Mr. Wright rather than I, because he can help us learn more about his observations. Phone numbers are below me on the screen right now for our radio listeners. They're 202-585-3880 for Republicans. Democrats dial us at 202-585-3881, and all others 202-585-3882. I want to find, if I can, Mr. Wright, what I saw as the operative paragraph here, essentially your conclusion after all of your time there about life in Saudi Arabia, which is essentially that it is, here it is. I had begun to look at Saudi society as a collection of opposing forces. The liberals against the religious conservatives, the royal family versus democratic reformers, the unemployed against the expats, the old against the young, men against women. The question is whether the anger that results from all this conflict will be directed outward at the West or inward at the Saudi regime.
All right. It's a very paralyzed and polarized situation, and there aren't very many creative solutions being put forward to get them out of the box that they're in. And I think that accounts a lot for the sense of despair and depression that I felt while I was there.
You talked regularly about people dealing with stress and people dealing with depression. Tell some stories about how that manifested itself.
Well, one day I had 4 different people talk to me about the fact that they were depressed. These unsolicited, you know, people coming up to me. One of my reporters said, you know, I didn't get to sleep until 4 last night. I was up sitting beside the Red Sea just worrying. And then I was in a gym, and I do yoga. I was doing a headstand, and this guy walked up to me and he cranked his head over and he said, "Would that help for depression?" And I said, well, it might. And so I helped him up against the wall. But, you know, again and again, people talk to me about the fact that they were so dispirited.
And
even those
what are the causes of this stress, this dispiritedness?
I think there are several really major observations that I would have. One is that they have so few opportunities to express themselves, especially the young people. There's very little to do. And there are very few ways to get out in society. If you wanted to be a musician, for instance, there's very little opportunity to play music. If you wanted to work in some kind of artistic medium, there aren't very many arts schools, there's no think tanks, there's no political parties, there's just very few ways of expressing yourself and trying to make a difference. And secondly, they feel stigmatized. You know, I was in Dallas when Kennedy was killed. I lived there, and you know, some of your viewers are probably old enough to remember how stigmatized Dallas was, you know, accused of killing Kennedy and so on. That times 100 is the way Saudis feel. They feel the world is turned against them, and they're humiliated and ashamed, and they don't know what to do about it.
How pervasive are the religious police in Saudi Arabia?
Well, you see them in the shopping malls and the restaurants and things like that. They're kind of scary and they're kind of comic at the same time. I was in Riyadh, and I deliberately went out to see one of the matawa, as they're called, and it was prayer time, and you know, I saw this group of Filipino men sitting. And then they suddenly ran away like flocks of geese off a pond, and right behind them was this fellow with a long, untrimmed beard and short thobe is the garment that men wear is called, and he's covered with kind of an ornamental robe. And he reminded me of the Lord High Executioner in the Mikado, you know, kind of leaning back and with his thumbs in his lapels. And then right beside him were these two real policemen who are his lackeys. And he would just go around and, you know, criticize women for the way they were dressed and shoo the men into the mosque and so on, and make sure that nobody was buying anything and that the restaurants weren't serving food until prayer time was over. That was funny enough, but there was one scene that I ran into that really disturbed me. I was in Riyadh, and I saw what was very uncommon, a woman with her head uncovered, standing on the street, and with her hair exposed. In fact, I never saw that, you know, in Riyadh at all until that moment. And she was quite a lovely woman, and she looked terribly frightened. And we exchanged a glance. I was getting into a cab, and I almost said, "Do you need a ride?" But if I had said such a thing, it would have been such an incredible breach of protocol. I mean, an unmarried couple could go to jail. So I didn't say anything, and the cab had to make a U-turn. And then as we were coming back, I saw that she had pulled up the hood of her abaya, and she was running. And right behind her was this Suburban that was the official car of the Matawa, and he was slowly trailing after her, and she was banging on shop windows trying to get in, but it was prayer time. And I was just so desperate to help her. I didn't know, I knew I was naive about the culture, but I just knew that anything I did would make the situation worse.
A last question before we get to calls, and that is the pervasiveness and presence of the religious police has to have the support of the Saudi royal family. What is their encouragement relationship overall with the fundamentalist Islamists in their country, and how does that all work?
Well, the religious police are government employees, and on top of that, they get a bounty for the arrests that they make, and so I think of them as being kind of religious vigilantes that the government has bought off. These people represent a larger core of society, and I think the government wants to mollify that group of people in their society by empowering the religious police to do these things. But most ordinary Saudis feel like they're like an occupying army, and they do absurd things. Like one Saudi told me that his daughter's in French school, and the religious police broke in and made them stop singing Alouette. Those kinds of things are very alienating to a society.
Let's take our first call for you. It is from Duluth, Minnesota. You're on the air for Lawrence Wright.
Hi.
Good morning.
Morning. I read a book called The Iron Triangle, and it talked about the link between the Saudis and the terrorism groups, and it seemed like the Carlyle Group and a few others tried to downplay that link, and they actually used ex-military specialists in Vietnam that were retired to train some of their people over there, and it actually spilled off into some of the terrorists. Some of that training did. I'm going to hang up and listen for your comment.
The Saudi society is not just one thing, and so it's good to realize, I think, in trying to understand the contribution that the royal family and the government has made to terrorism, that at the same time they are one of the main targets of terrorists. It just shows you how confused the whole situation is. Back in 1991, bin Laden sought to lead the resistance against Iraq, and the Saudi royal family turned him down, preferring to rely upon 500,000 American troops. And ever since then, he's been at war with the Saudi royal family, and they took away his passport. He's no longer a Saudi, and these recent attacks on the Interior Ministry officials who are members of the royal family will show you that Al-Qaeda has come out of the closet and is directly attacking the royal family. Now, on the other hand, it's also true that members of the royal family and large segments of Saudi society contributed money to jihad, which empowered the very people that are now trying to destroy the royal family and the Saudi government.
Newport, Rhode Island. Good morning for Lawrence Wright.
Larry, I just wanted to call you and congratulate you on your wonderful success.
Thank you.
And I'm calling also on behalf of an old friend of yours, whom you knew at Tulane University, Jane Harrington. She's
oh,
my
really?
wife. And she wishes good wishes to your wife, Roberta, also.
Well, that's wonderful.
And Jane is returning today from Spain, where she has been visiting our daughter, Meredith, who is a junior year abroad, of course, from Tulane University.
Right.
She's at Tulane there also. So we live in Newport, and Jane is the professor of modern languages at Salve Regina University here in Newport.
Well, please send her my love.
And one other thing, I just wanted to say, I very much enjoyed your article on about the second-in-command that you wrote for the New York.
Oh, Ayman al-Zawahiri last year.
Yes,
yeah.
And it was wonderful. I'll be looking forward to reading your new article on Saudi Arabia. I just wanted to ask you one question before I leave, and wish you best wishes. How do you see the differences between your experiences in Saudi Arabia with the period you spent in Egypt when you were teaching there?
Well, I taught in Egypt from 1969 to 71, as long ago, but I was back in Egypt for 3 months last year working on the article that he referred to about Ayman al-Zawahiri, the number 2 man in Al-Qaeda. And it was interesting. Egypt is a very volatile, mischievous, humorous, dynamic society. And we would, last year I was involved in these arguments that would go on until 3 in the morning about 9/11 and who's responsible and so on. It's characteristic. Late nights in the cafe in Cairo. Very volatile, lots of fun, lots of anger sometimes. In Saudi Arabia, there was very little of that. There was this ominous suppression of feeling that seemed more dangerous to me. just smothered emotions is the feeling that I got in Cairo, and very little of that in Egypt, where people are so exuberant.
Since what brought you there was to work in the newspapers, can you tell our audience about the access to information that Saudi citizens have?
Well, no newspaper that's ultimately controlled by the government can fulfill its obligation to its readers.
And are all the newspapers there controlled by the government?
Yes. Here's the arrangement. There are a dozen papers that are sold in Saudi Arabia, and some of them very good. The good ones tend to be published from London. You are not allowed to write about anything controversial about Islam, about the government, or about the royal family, which are all the most important things. And each editor-in-chief has to be approved by the Ministry of Information, and that is a department of the Ministry of the Interior. That is the same office that runs the secret police. And so the ultimate arbiter of the press is Prince Knife, who runs the secret police. He reminds me a little bit of J. Edgar Hoover. He kind of plays that same role in that society, of having a lot of power, being kind of a scary and sometimes sinister figure in the minds of ordinary Saudis. But if you can imagine a country in which J. Edgar Hoover controls the newspapers, that's kind of the situation that you have in Saudi Arabia. It's not to say that there aren't some good reporters, and I worked with some of them, but the bridles on their freedom are really evident. Just
quickly, can people watch satellite TV from around the world, and do they have access to the internet easily?
Satellite TV, they're the main consumers in the Arab world. They may be the main consumers in the whole world. They're avid for news from the outside. And
is it censored?
No.
So that acts as a counterweight to the newspapers, which are?
Yes. And the internet is, however, it took me forever to get set up, because there are these screens, these protocols that you have to have installed, and there are certain web pages you can't access, and so the internet is constantly being monitored. Although I can't imagine a government clever enough to outrun, 17-year-old boys on the internet. So I think that's ultimately going to be a failed operation as well. But these have jumped the dam, and so that people can see things that are going on outside of their information system. But at the same time, it's hard to get information about what's actually happening in the country, because so few foreign reporters are allowed in the country.
Lawrence Wright is our guest. He'll be with us till the top of the hour. He had a rare opportunity to spend 3 months this year in Saudi society. We're learning more about that and what he wrote about in the New Yorker as a result of it. And next call is Jackpot, Nevada.
Oh, good morning.
Good morning.
When you were describing that poor lady running down the street banging on windows with a car following her, it sort of reminded me of that. I just watched a movie the other day called Not Without My Daughter. It was Sally Fields was playing the mother, and it just seems to me that that it's kind of a mindset in the whole Middle East there. It's I just can't even imagine the world they live in. It must be a living hell. I know that they had a female commander at one time out there on the Air Force Base, and they made her put what their version of a burqa is. Mm-hmm. And just if you were a clergyman or something, you had to hide your symbols, and it just seems like, why do we even want to be around people like this? I personally, we talk about it kind of casually, but can you imagine America even, they give Bush a hard time, but can you imagine if he had people chasing women through the streets?
Well, thanks. You've given us a lot of different areas to work with. Yeah. Let me first ask, he says life must be a living hell there. What's your reaction to that?
Well, it'd be easier to say that it's boring and it's culturally sterile. That's a real problem, though. I mean, when so much unemployment among young people and there's so little diversion, it is very troubling because it's one of the I think one of the major reasons that some of these kids turn to Islamic extremism and to terrorism.
How widespread is the unemployment and why?
Well, let me first of all say that every statistic that you read about Saudi Arabia is fundamentally a lie. It's all made up. So if I were to tell you that unemployment is 30%, bear in mind I'm making that up just like everybody else. There's no real figures in Saudi Arabia at all, although they're sometimes bandied about authoritatively. One gets the sense that unemployment among men is 30-40%. It's about 95% among women. And most of the jobs are held by foreigners. So you have a large population of people who are idle. In the past, up until the oil shocks in the 90s, the government hired most of Saudi university graduates, and that largely took care of the unemployment problem. But once the oil prices shot down, the government was no longer able to afford that, and the phenomenon of the unemployed Saudi male became a dismal truth in Saudi society.
And they're at the same time well educated, is that not correct?
Very well educated. I mean, it was interesting to me because I've spent some time in other Arab countries, and it's a very literate population. A lot of the middle class have traveled abroad in the West. They certainly know a lot more about us than we know about them.
Akron, Ohio, good morning.
Morning. It took years and years and years to demonize the Islamic community worldwide like has been done. You cannot look at this issue in a microcosm. You have to think about the whole area, even the Islamic community in America here, even the Islamic community in Africa. Look what was done to Mohammed Mossadegh in Iran. We probably would have had a dynamic democracy in Iran, but nobody wanted that. Everybody wanted the Israelis to be the only democracy in the area, so America could be the shining city on the hill here, with their little demon Zionists as the shining city on the hill in the Middle East, while everybody gradually, over 60 or more years, was taken downhill and turned into this little sad dynamic that you talk about, where everybody's so sad and everybody's so oppressed and their girls are just dying to be Britney Spears. Come on now. This was, I remember the Popeye cartoons 60 years ago when Bluto was dressed up like the Sheikh and he was this demon. The Zionists have done this, and it's got to stop.
Thank you. Mr. Wright?
Well, I agree that that Arabs and Muslims have been demonized in our culture, and I hope I haven't contributed to that. I think that we do hold the responsibility for supporting a lot of authoritarian figures that have oppress their own people, and I think that we have to change that. I had a conversation with the American ambassador who since left that post, Robert Jordan, when I was in Riyadh, and I said, I hate constantly being told that, I as an American am responsible for the people that are in power, whether I'm in Egypt or in Saudi Arabia, wherever. Why can't we support democratic reform in these countries and really show what America stands for? And he said essentially that we're not ready for these people to have an election because the Islamists will come to power and they have a lot of money and they have a defense agreement with Pakistan. They'll have the nuclear bomb. This is not something we can tolerate. So essentially, the American policy at that time, and Bush has since changed his tune, but was we're afraid of the people. We're afraid of the Islamic people. And we don't want them to be Democrats, because the last thing we want is for the people to be in control. And I'm very much opposed to that policy myself.
Washington, D.C., good morning.
Good morning, C-SPAN. Thank you so much for taking my call. I'm a first-time caller. My question is, you spent 3 months there, right?
That's correct.
I always heard this, that they don't allow any other faith to be practiced. Is it a true statement?
Yeah, it's true in several different ways. I mean, you know, there have been different kind of under-the-table agreements for Christians who are in the service, the American service, you know, to practice privately and so on. Some of the British Christians had private services, and then they were busted. The other thing is that only one strain of Islam is allowed to be practiced. And, you know, Saudi Arabia has a large Shia population, and also it's the home of the two holy sites, Mecca and Medina. And it used to be that other strains of Islam, of which there are many different schools, were allowed to practice their religion and to preach in Mecca. And that's been stopped. And I think one thing that would help open up that society considerably is if it simply allowed itself to hear other voices within Islam other than the Wahhabi voice that it preaches.
Mr. Wright, here's, I guess, the critical question. After 3 months of looking up close at this society, were you able to understand what put all of those Saudi hijackers on the airplanes on September 11th?
I went up to Taif, which is a little mountain town near Jeddah, where one of the hijackers, Hani Hanjour, had come from. And I had an interview with his brother, Yasser, and to try to find out, you know, some answers to that question. Hani, his only goal was to be a pilot, and he couldn't get a job in Saudi Airlines, and really there were very few alternatives for him. When he got turned down from that job, he spent 6 months in his room just with the door closed. And I said, well, why was he so depressed? And, you know, the answer was this joblessness. And I think he felt, you know, that his life was pointless. And here was Osama bin Laden giving him a chance to make history. And he had no reason to live, he felt, without a way to contribute to society, and suddenly here is a chance to change the world. I think that is the kind of magnet that draws a lot of despairing young people to this kind of cause.
The government, of course, is a long ally of Washington. Among the rank and file, what's the view of Washington versus bin Laden?
I'm sorry, the view of Washington versus...
No, I mean, the people on the street, are they more supportive of Washington or more supportive of bin Laden?
Oh, it varies. I mean, there is, to some extent, bin Laden is a proxy for a lot of the things that they would like to say themselves. For instance, very few people criticize the government openly. Bin Laden voices those criticisms that other people are afraid to say. There's a lot of anger at the West and at the U.S., and bin Laden voices that anger. So to some extent, they feel a connection with his sentiments. At the same time, for the most part, the last thing they want to see is somebody like bin Laden running their country. And you know, there is a lot of fear of democracy inside Saudi Arabia as well, because they think, you know, this might be the result, is that we would have this democratic revolution and only to find Osama bin Laden being our ruler.
San Antonio, good morning to you.
Good morning. I spent some time in Riyadh as a military member back in the 80s, and it did make me really love the separation of state that we have in America. And I thought the military handled that, making that woman put her essentially a burqa on her head sort of wrong, because I felt that if for instance the Saudi or any government said, well, you aren't allowed to have blacks in our country, then we'd have done more about it. But they essentially told her, cover your head, you're in their country. And I do fear some of the Wahhabi Christians we have in America. And thank you.
I guess by Wahhabi Christians he means fundamentalist Christians, and I think that there's a confusion within Islam, and especially within Wahhabi Islam, between what the Prophet Muhammad wanted the role of women to be in society, and what traditional tribal culture has decreed for women in the past. And there's, for instance, no reason given in the Quran for women and men not to worship together, and yet they're strictly separated in the mosque. There is a passage in the Quran that talks about when a woman and a man are alone together in a room, the devil is a third party. But it doesn't mean that women and men in groups have to be separated as they are in every aspect of Saudi society. And this is becoming predominant not only in Saudi Arabia, but because of its amazingly influential voice throughout the Muslim world. There's just gender apartheid is increasing inside that country and throughout Islam.
Mr. Wright, here's a viewer who sent us an email who disagrees with your description of society. Here's what she writes. 3 months is not long enough to learn Saudi society. Having lived and worked there as a Western woman for 5 years, it is obvious that Mr. Wright is a bit tainted from Western propaganda. Expat women mostly go heads uncovered, and Saudis are extremely tolerant of Western ways. The walled compounds are for the protection of Western ways carried on in the compounds. We were always allowed day or night to leave the compounds and go to the villages or cities alone or in groups. Certain neighborhoods are strict by choice. Ordinary people may come up and ask you to cover your head. We always carried a scarf since it is their country. And here's the last. Once you meet the people, they have many fun get-togethers, and life there is hardly boring except to Westerners who can only derive their entertainment from paid entertainers. He no doubt skipped the soccer matches and the camel races and sunsets in the dunes.
Well, I didn't skip all of that. I can only report what my reporters were telling me about their own lives, and I was seeing Saudi Arabia largely through the eyes of these young reporters that I was training, and they confided to me how they felt, and I want to say I wasn't bored because I was incredibly stimulated by my experience there, but there were just so few opportunities for them, and they felt stuck, and they even, just boy meets girl. This is very difficult in Saudi Arabia, and the stimulation that young people get from meeting members of the opposite sex, it's very difficult to get together, and you have the religious police constantly patrolling to try and keep them apart. Even something as like Valentine's Day, the religious police come in and they make they confiscate everything red, and so the florist would be hiding the roses under the table so that they wouldn't be stolen by the religious police. It's a suppression of ordinary instinct that makes it very difficult for young people to feel fulfilled and excited in their own society.
Boston, you're on the air. Welcome.
Oh, hi, good morning. Yeah, I think the Saudis are getting a bum rap. I read your article last night and I was fascinated with it because I'd spent 6 years in Riyadh in the 1970s, and it's one of the best periods of my life. I made a lot of money for doing very little.
Right.
And the question I have is when I went to Saudi Arabia, I had to show a Baptist certificate to prove that I wasn't Jewish in order to get an entry visa. And today I read about people like Tom Friedman who were running around Saudi Arabia and apparently had the ear of Prince Abdullah, Has the relationship between Saudi Arabia and Israel and Saudi Arabia and Jews, has it changed at all? And that's my question. And if someone wanted to get in touch with you, how would they do that? Thanks.
First of all, if you want to get in touch with me, the best way is to email me, Lawrence, Lawrence _ Wright, WRIGHT, at newyorker.com. It's true that Jews can now come into the country. You do have to declare your religious affiliation on the visa, but like all visitors to the kingdom, you have to be invited. And so there's a filter. Tom Friedman is there because of his status at the New York Times. It's not encouraged. I was trying to help a Saudi prince who wanted a publicist to come over and train some of his young publicists. And I proposed, first of all, idiotically, I proposed a woman. And then I proposed someone who was Jewish, and he passed on that opportunity as well. So the upshot was that he didn't get anybody to train his young workers. It's still very hard, I think.
Topeka is next. Good morning.
Yes, good morning to you both. Mr. Wright, I just called to comment you in a sense. It's been refreshing listening to you here this morning. I feel a great sense of honesty coming from you, and that's somewhat unheard of now. It's certainly removed from the effort to sensationalize information and cause it to be somewhat tainted. I have a question, however. With your experience in the Middle East, do you get the sense that there is a notion engulfed in foreign policy to cause the Israelis to somewhat become a surrogate enforcer in the Middle East, if you will, among other Arab countries, and this is the catalyst which is fueling the militarization, if you will, from Western countries in order to control the Arab population?
My feeling is that Israel, the Israeli-Palestinian situation is a fatal disease in that whole region, and it's not only hurting the Arabs, it's hurting the Israelis. And there was an earlier caller that was saying something about how that we wanted the Israelis to be the only democracy. I don't think that's entirely true. I hope that we can create an Arab Islamic democracy in Iraq, and that could provide a model for these other countries. In fact, I think it's practically the only thing we can do that might help. And it would be a dramatic change for the better if there was some model that other countries could look at and say, this works, the people are happier, they're more prosperous, they're free to express themselves. And if we could leave that kind of legacy in the Middle East, it would be an enormous contribution.
This question comes by email from a viewer in Walnut Creek, California, who writes, I would imagine all Saudis know the wealth of oil their country has, but the U.S. continues to purchase it without any conditions on the royal families to share such wealth. Do you believe that the U.S. contributes to some of the hatred that the average Saudi feels given the trickle-down trade policy on oil? And do you think if the U.S. changed its policy to require the Saudi government to share the oil wealth with the average Saudi, this would help in reducing the anti-American sentiment?
I think there are real limits on what America can do to change Saudi society. There was a editorial when I was there in one of the papers that said, we have to change our educational system even though the Americans say we must. And I think that's kind of the attitude most Saudis have. Yes, we need to change, but they're resistant to the kind of shoving that they get from us. The question gets to the role of the royal family, though, and the Saudis, there are a lot of people in Saudi Arabia that are very upset with the royal family, They would love to see a different system, but they look around their neighborhood and they see the revolutions that, in Egypt that brought Mubarak, and Iraq that brought Saddam Hussein, and Libya that brought Muammar Gaddafi, and Somalia. I mean, the neighborhood they're in, the models haven't been very encouraging. And so there's a good reason for the fact that there's been such a resistance to change. And the royal family counts on that anxiety to stay in power and to continue to take those oil profits for themselves. So they haven't taken everything as they did in Nigeria, for instance. So one can, if you're a Saudi, you can say, well, at least we have roads, we have schools, our education, our health care is free. And I don't know that it's within the power of the United States to change that. I think it's going to be the Saudis that'll have to change it themselves.
Here's a little bit of what Mr. Wright writes in his New Yorker article. The oil wealth of the country runs first through royal pockets. Various businessmen and economists speculate that as much as 30 or 40% is skimmed by the Al Saud family. With Saudi Arabia containing 1/4 of the world's known oil reserves, the government has no need to tax its citizen. As he said, education and health care are free, but there is little evidence of public wealth or charity. As I explored the kingdom, I noticed few parks or playgrounds or museums. There are not enough universities or private schools to serve the population, practically no research institution, few public arts groups, and no human rights organizations. Philanthropy fails to make up for the government's neglect. For one thing, the absence of taxes means there are no charitable deductions and therefore no financial incentives for giving. We're talking about this article. Next telephone call comes from Fayetteville, Arkansas.
Thank you very much. And I have several comments. I hope you will allow me to make them. Our family has taught in the Mideast for years, and we have close friends that worked over there. They wouldn't be getting the oil out of the ground if we weren't over there, and they want us there. So to blame the Americans for everything that's going on there is not right. We tutored some of their children, some of the royal family's children. They will not let them even see the word Israel. You cannot fly from Saudi Arabia to Israel. So they're not allowing ideas from outside to be brought in, and that's not America's fault. Yet the royal family and the more wealthy people that keep the women oppressed over there come to America and participate in some of the very things that they supposedly hate us for. So your comment a minute ago to say that Bush had changed his tune is really, I think, a bad play on words about Iraq. We want more democracy over there. That's what the Western country wants. We don't want to oppress these people. That's not our desire at all. And when you've worked and lived over there for years, you find these things out. You learn them for yourself. Thank you very much.
Well, I think that America's done a better job of pushing forward American power than American values in that region of the world. And the main criticism I always get when I'm in the Middle East is a sense that you're not the country you say you are. And I think that we really should stand for, democratic values, capitalism, freedom, those kinds of things that we don't represent in the Middle East. And I think we could do a lot better job of doing that. And I hope that we will try to do that in Iraq.
Next phone call, Augusta, Georgia. Good morning, caller.
I'd like to say that the lady from Arkansas is totally representative of the third world attitudes that exist and permeate the area that I reside in, which is the South. But on the subject, isn't it true that the young men in Saudi Arabia who cannot find jobs cannot have a social life because they cannot get married, they cannot have children, and they're not accepted in the society? So how can they exist and have a decent life? So why would they be motivated to not be terrorists?
I think one of the major problems in that country, if not the most important problem, is the alienation of men and women. And it goes at all levels of society, but it's especially acute at the age when young men and young women are trying to get together. It's very difficult. You see if you're driving in traffic in Jeddah, you'll see cars slow down. Women are in cars as passengers in the back seat, but they'll often have a driver in front, and they're young girls, but their heads are covered and so on. But the boys in the other cars will slow down and they'll exchange telephone numbers. Or if you're in a mall, that's one of the few public places where men and women congregate. It's simultaneously, and little flick of the hand as a telephone number is exchanged. That surreptitious, kind of almost like clandestine encounters, and then over the internet there are chat rooms and so on. So they do have a way of communicating, but it's so furtive, and there's no freedom of the opportunity just to sit down in a cafe and talk. It's all done in an undercover manner, and then there's the obstacle of once you meet a girl, if you meet a girl, how do you afford to marry her? There are dowries. You have to get an apartment. It has to be furnished. It's a very expensive proposition. So typically marriages are delayed, and I think there's another thing that troubles me about this separation of the sexes, and that's the fact that there's the absence of socialization among the young men. I mean, they don't. It's part of being in society is learning how to be with women, and they don't have that opportunity, and it is a little deforming, I think, on a man's personality when he doesn't have the encounter with the female world that is true of the Saudi society right now.
Here's a photograph that accompanied the article. It is of the pilgrimage, the Hajj it's called, which is required of all Muslims to make at least once in their lifetime to visit the holy sites in Mecca, and you can see the crowds at this gathering, which is the 2003 gathering this photograph is from, Mr. Wright?
Yes, and that was really an interesting experience for me. Of course, I wasn't allowed to go to Mecca, but that was my first job as this coach of these young reporters, was to supervise the coverage of the Hajj, and I can't think of anyone less qualified than myself to do that. But it was fascinating. I was very moved by. I was constantly watching it on television, and talking to my reporters by telephone in Mecca, and it's such an overwhelming experience. 2 million people coming to worship, and they, as they approach Mecca, they take off their regular suits and clothes, and they put on essentially towels or sheets that are the garments of the Haji, who is supposed to approach. It's an enactment of the Day of Judgment, and you're supposed to approach God with nothing but your good deeds, and it's a very humble. I think quite beautiful experience, and it was really intriguing for me to learn about it.
Fairfield, Illinois for Lawrence Wright. Good morning.
Hi, good morning, Mr. Wright.
Good morning.
You're certainly doing a great service on the show this morning.
Thank you.
And it has been well over 20 years, late 70s, since I've been in the kingdom. And I'm wondering if the public execution has subsided any. The reason I ask is that within a 30-minute period, somewhere between 10 o'clock and 11 o'clock one morning, I was escorted and forced to observe 2 public executions. And from what I learned at the time, of course, the government would pay whalers to come up close to the execution and cry, and the Westerners, of course, were the whalers were pushed aside, and the Westerners, of course, were brought right up to the site, and I to this day have occasional dreams and nightmares about this, and I'm just wondering if if their society has tempered itself in any, and that they have cut this out.
No, there's still public executions. I'm opposed to death penalty in any case, but I live in Texas, and we have more public executions, more executions than they do in Saudi Arabia. So in some ways, I feel that the Saudis have gotten kind of a bum rap strictly because of their method of execution, which is, in my opinion, no more inhumane than lethal injection. And I kind of think that if we were cutting off people's heads in the middle of Houston, we might have a lower crime penalty than we currently do. So maybe it's more efficacious. But just because they do it in public doesn't seem to make it any worse than it is in Texas.
Next call is from Longview, Texas. Good morning.
Good morning. Yeah, I was wanting to make the comment that I believe that the United States is a Celtic nation. Scots and Irish and Britons formed and framed this country, and that the fundamental problem with our dealing with the Middle East, with the Saudis, with Afghanistan, with all those countries over there, is our government and our media try to treat their society as if it is sort of identical to our society. The people over there don't have the same beliefs and values that the Celts have had, for centuries and centuries, and that exhibit themselves in our own society. So it's to me mistaken to think that Saudi society is going to be any different just because we want our type of democracy over there. That they even grasp the concept of the type of freedoms that we have here is to me mistaken. And it just. Yeah, I was wondering if Mr. Wright agrees with that, or if anybody else agrees with that. I believe that we could make a whole lot of difference in the way the world sees us by changing the way we treat the world and not trying to behave like everybody out there has the same values and same beliefs and same system in society that we have.
Thank you.
Well, let me start by saying that I would not describe our country as a Celtic society, and nor do I aspire for it to be such a thing. I like the way our country is becoming as diverse and universalist as it is, and it becomes a kind of model for the rest of the world for people living together. And that is a message that that our country has a profound obligation to deliver. So I think of my America as being a little different from the one the caller expresses. And I also feel that everybody that I met in Saudi Arabia wants very much the same things I want. There are differences in their culture, but they still want to be free to express themselves. Just as within our culture there are religious groups that have very strong views about how society should be should exist, how people should be in that society, and so on. So too do you have in Saudi Arabia people with very strong religious views about how men and women should be, and so on. I think most Saudis chafe at those restrictions and would like to have more freedom of engagement between the sexes and more freedom to communicate their real thoughts to their friends on television, in newspapers, and so on, have more participation in their government. And I think of those things as being very American and universal.
Our next telephone call for Lawrence Wright is from Poto, Oklahoma. Good morning, caller. Go ahead.
I just turned on about 15 minutes ago. I watched C-SPAN a lot, but I just got in on this. And I wanted to say that I lived in Saudi Arabia for 17 years, and we moved back right after September 11th. And I think that one of the mistakes that the Americans make is that we don't understand that their culture is completely different. They don't think the same way we do. The society in Saudi Arabia and most of the Middle Eastern countries is based on their religion. They are very religious, and Sharia law, which is the law of Islam, is the law of the country. And it's true that the young men don't have a lot to do, and that is a problem. But they, excuse me.
You still there?
Yeah, I am. What I'd like to say is that the young women, or a lot of the women, they don't see this as oppression. You know, they can't drive, and they see this as wonderful. They've got drivers, or the men in their family drive them to all women malls where they shop, and I just don't see that. I don't think that a lot of the majority of them are, especially the uneducated ones, feel the oppression that we see that according to our society, we think that they have.
Thanks. I need to interrupt you only because our time's running out. Let's pick up that point with Mr. Wright.
Well, I think there's a diversion of views among women in Saudi Arabia. I met women in Saudi Arabia that are, as this caller describes, fairly content with the system, but I met a lot that were very dissatisfied and were longing for a change. I'll tell you a little bit about some of the reporters that I worked with. So I had 3 young women reporters, and one in particular, Najla, she covered her face entirely except for this little eye slit where she had these gold-rimmed glasses, and that was all I saw of Najla. And she had had an American education, but she had come back to Saudi Arabia and deliberately adopted the most conservative robes and so on. She's a very, very conservative woman. Yet, she is angry that she can't drive. For one reason, she doesn't like to be in a car with a man. So she feels like she ought to be able to drive herself. She's very independent. She wants to be able to travel, but she can't travel unless her father gives her written permission. She wants a good job, and Saudi Arabia doesn't offer her a good job. So this is an example of, I think, a characteristic in many ways Saudi woman who is perplexed, a little confused, and stunted by the lack of alternatives open to her. I think she is broadly representative of a lot of Saudi women.
Last call is from Roundup, Montana. Good morning.
Hello. I have a question for Mr. Wright. Before September 11th, there were reports that Osama bin Laden had used his notoriety as a hero against the Russians to try to change our policies against Israel, and that he wrote many letters to the United States and had much discussion trying to change this. And when Ariel Sharon, we allowed Israel to put him in as prime minister, it was a real slap in the face to the Arab world, and he followed through with his threats.
I don't know exactly what you're talking about in terms of letters that he wrote. Most of his communication with the American government has been in the form of fatwas, which are very public. And 1996 and 97, he declared war against America and so on. I don't think that the evolution of Israeli politics has affected him a bit. One of his primary goals, number one goal on his fatwa and when he declared war on the Americans, was that they get their military group out of Saudi Arabia, and we've done that, and that hasn't changed a thing. So I doubt that there's much that we can do to mollify him.
You've heard some reference to Mr. Wright's article about Osama bin Laden's second in command, Dr. al-Zawahiri. It won, by the way, the Overseas Press Club Award, and it is available on the New Yorker's website if you'd like to read it. It's newyorker.com. The current article, the one we're talking about today about the House of Saud and life in Saudi Arabia, called Kingdom of Silence, is in the brand new New Yorker. It's the January 5th edition, available on newsstands all around the country. Lawrence Wright, thank you very much for spending our December 31st with us.
Oh, thank you. It was a pleasure.
We appreciate it. From all of us at the Washington Journal staff and all of us at C-SPAN, we wish you a very happy New Year. We'll be back tomorrow morning at 7 a.m. bright and early with your phone calls in the newspapers, and we'll see you then.